what we're going to try to get to, and I think each of you is going to have come on this in your own way, but what we're trying to get to, I suppose, is two things. It's the realism of 2040, or lack of realism of 2040, but it's also the practical steps that need to be taken along the road. So I'm going to ask Mårten Levenstam, who's Senior Vice President for Product Strategy and Business Ownership at Volvo Cars, to kick us off. And to do that, Mårten, I will pass across to there. So you're welcome to come up to the stage, or indeed to speak from there if you prefer.
I'll stand up if that's
Good.
okay. And I'll do it really short. So thank you and good morning. I'm really happy to be here. So I need to tell you a story. It's the Midsummer Festival in Sweden. I live in Sweden. That's the big thing in Sweden every summer, bigger than Christmas. I had to travel to my parents' country house. It's a 500-kilometer long drive. And the good thing about that, besides meeting my parents, is I get to drive the family car when I'm there. And that's an old MG TC from 1952. So that's the best car in the family. So think about that. That was 1952. And that car is actually quite terrible to drive. It's really fun, but it's quite a terrible car. So a lot of things has happened. So I took my new Volvo back home, and then I could stream Spotify with my favorite music into the speakers. The navigation system gave me direction, kept an eye on traffic, showing it on a head-up display. Most of the time, the car was actually doing the driving. I still need to supervise it. But a lot of things has happened since that old MG. It's still fun to drive. And I don't think things are not linear in development. Things are not just from an MG TC gradually getting better and better. We are right now at the tipping point where things will change. The next 5 years, you will see so big changes in our industry that we have never seen before. So we talked about it, autonomous drive, that's really cheap computing power and artificial intelligence. We will have cars out on the streets 5 years from now without drivers behind the steering wheel. We will have electric cars with zero tailpipe emissions and low carbon content. That will happen. All cars will be connected. We see things like Uber, new sharing, and new types of mobility patterns. That will happen within the next 5 years. So you shouldn't look back and just think that things are a gradual, incremental, one step at a time from 1950 and onwards. Things will change dramatically. And I think the important thing is it will change much more than the car industry. It will change the way we live and the way our cities are planned. It's really a city planning exercise. And we need to take that, we need to discuss that together, how we would like our future to be. Because in my job, everyone asked me, Mårten, give us the forecast for the future. Will 2040, will that happen? Or will it be 2030? Give us your best forecast. And I hate that. You can do forecasts for weather, because weather just happens. But the future is something you can shape. So it's not so interesting to discuss my forecast about the future. We need to discuss what future we would like to have. And I think if you look at road safety, we basically cut road fatalities in half every 15 years, consistently since the MGTC, since the 50s. Every 15 years, road fatalities has been slashed in half. And it's still going on. So how did that happen? Of course, Volvo makes the world's safest cars, but I can't take the credit for all of that. We've done it together. So governments have done their part, infrastructure is better, cars are of course much better, and you are a lot better. You actually buckle up nowadays, and you don't drive drunk anymore. So people's behavior have changed as well. And that happened without any confrontation. There were no demonstration. No one was talking about put a ban on this or a ban on that. We did it together, hardly noticing it. And the modern car, when it comes to safety, it has, it's so expensive. They've spent massive investments to do it, but it just happened. So now when we talk about our future in 2040, why can't we do that in the same way? I don't view this as a rhetorical exercise where I should convince you about something. I think we need an intelligent discussion where we talk and learn something together.
Perfect. Okay, well, that's a very good way to start it off. Mårten, for the time being, thank you. Let's turn to Ian Plummer, who's Manufacturer and Agency Director at Auto Trade.
Thank you. I'm going to stay sitting if that's okay. I won't teach you anything, I don't think, by just highlighting that Auto Trader is the leading marketplace in the UK automotive landscape. But what I think is relevant in this context is, as a marketplace, we get a good view on what's going on across the industry, from consumer to brand to retailer, right across the piece, sitting at the heart, I'd suggest, of that landscape. And the overriding message that I think we see at the moment, or the vibe and the sentiment that we see at the moment, is definitely across all of those three stakeholder sets, is one of, firstly, confusion, secondly, I'd suggest uncertainty, and third, of change. If I start with the consumer, we have a vast amount of data on what the consumer is actually thinking, but more importantly, what they're doing. They spend 10 times more minutes on our site in a given month than they do on all of the OEM websites combined in the UK. They search a lot, 4 times more than Google in the UK, so we know what they're thinking and what they're searching. And right now, they are uncertain. They're uncertain because of Brexit, for sure, but they're more uncertain because of the demonisation of diesel. They're uncertain about things like autonomous. They don't even know what that means. Even the today technology, things like ACC and all the 3-letter acronyms we have in the industry, they just don't get. So they don't know what's going on. And the reason why that's important is they're buying fewer cars. If they're buying fewer cars, that's bad news for all of us. Certainly bad news for those building them, and certainly bad news for those selling them. I don't think it's either good news for the consumer buying them. Looking next at the OEMs, I think Ian highlighted extremely clearly what the challenges are there. Now, we know, Mike pointed out, that the UK industry investment levels are declining, but worldwide they are boosting beyond belief. They're investing themselves in their own direct technology. They're purchasing options and shares in other ventures, mobility ventures, digital players, and so on, putting bets out there. And I just suggest that anybody who is in the betting industry would know that when you place a few bets, you win some, but you also lose some. So again, a huge element of uncertainty there, and increased cost at a time where, for electric vehicles in particular, in the road to 2040, more specifically, we know that those vehicles are reducing the margins of manufacturers. So you know that when you're selling an electric vehicle of current technology, you're generally replacing a quite profitable car with one that is far less profitable, and that's a big challenge. That then lastly poses a huge challenge for retailers, who have to wonder, within all of that, how to make a way for themselves and be part of that challenge towards 2040.
Okay, well, we'll pick up on several of those themes as well. Brian Mormino, next Executive Director, Worldwide Environmental Strategy and Compliance at Cummins Incorporated.
Oh, thank you very much. Since I've been here a week, I've been reading a lot about Brexit. It's been in every single conversation. It's been a good hiatus for me. And then the second speaker throws up Donald Trump and Jerry Brown. And I thought, was that why they have me on this panel? So we can talk about some U.S. politics? Hopefully not. But I applaud London, UK, SMMT for really looking out into the future. Appreciate being on this panel to look out to 2040 and talk about what that future holds. It's the right time to be forward-looking. 100 years ago next year, Cummins started. And we started by getting the Rudolph diesel patent and thinking about diesel technology and the path forward from that technology. And we've come a long way. Today, we're the world's largest independent engine manufacturer, and we have 16 sites in the UK, and we export about 60% of our products globally out of the UK, so significant presence in terms of a variety of markets. Our view of the future is one of diversified power. We serve very different customers than Pascar. We've talked about Pascar a lot already this morning, but we focus on commercial applications. And the important things to think about from commercial applications as we talk about the future and technology is that those who buy our products depend upon them for their livelihood, right? They buy them to make money. That's different. We also depend on them a lot, you and I. We depend upon them to build the bridges that we drive on, to get the goods to our house, our food, and to also keep our hospitals running. These are the applications that we serve. It is this work that really defines the power needs and where we specialize. So how many hundreds of miles does that vehicle need to run in a day? How many people does it have to carry? How much freight? Does it have to go over a mountain? Is it going to start and stop all day? These are the critical questions that we really have to take into account as we pave the future forward and think about technologies. And that's why we really see it as a diversified fuel future. We're ready for that future on a variety of means. So is it diesel engines, which provide unparalleled power for these applications like long haul, who have to do a significant amount of work? and just over the last 2 decades have reduced their particulate emissions by 99%? Is it our natural gas engines that with the right fueling infrastructure are near zero nitrogen oxide emissions that form ozone? Is it the hybrids that provide a clean, flexible power source, and Cummins is the leading provider globally? Or electric? Cummins recently acquired Johnson Matthey Battery Systems in Milton Keynes, looking at this future. And in the next 6 months, we'll be having an electrified power system for bus applications. Or is it the more advanced technologies like hydrogen fuel cells, which are still a ways out, but is a place where we're spending some time and energy to think about where does that technology make sense for the future? The choice of which of these technologies for which application in which time frame is a critical one. And what we need to recognize is that if we misstep on that, it can have significant ramifications because it can leave people on the side of the road and it can leave us not getting the goods and services that we so depend upon. So that technology can be paused or even stopped if we're not careful about that future. So Cummins, we push for tough, clear, and enforceable rules. Lead time, consistency of regulations, technology neutral, research and development incentives, infrastructure. These are the many policy questions where we focus and will play out this future and where we go. It is an exciting future. The technology for cleaner air is here today. We already talked about how turning the older fleet is a significant step that we can have. And it will be increasingly so across the numerous power sources going forward. Our energy and environmental challenges are significant, and Cummins stands ready to help. But we've got to work very closely together to pave this future forward for a cleaner, more efficient power future out to 2040. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Thanks a lot, Brian. Let's turn to David Martell, founder and chief executive of Chargemaster.
Thank you, Justin, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, we've been hearing about the road to zero, the electrification of the motor industry, and I think everybody recognises this is happening. There's a debate about how it's going to happen, the speed, the influence of government and so on, and whether it's going to be plug-in hybrid or pure electric and so on. But whichever way it goes, it needs an infrastructure. And at Chargemaster, we've been in the game of providing charging infrastructure for electric vehicles for some 10 years now. We've seen a huge transformation in the industry. That's nothing like as far as it's going to go in the next few years when we're ready for it. It's very exciting times. So how do people charge their cars? Is it going to be a problem? Can we put the infrastructure out there? What role has government? I get asked these questions all the time. And the answer is yes, we can cope with it. There's already the sector, a very strong private sector, particularly in the UK, that can provide that infrastructure to support the electrification on the road to zero. I can say that with confidence because people charge in very many different ways. You need to take away the concept of always going down to a petrol station to fill up your vehicle. That will be one of the ways, and I'm sure petrol companies, as with electricity companies, will be getting involved in the industry over the next few years. But you charge in many other ways, and it's actually electric vehicles got much more flexibility than a combustion engine vehicle. You can charge at home, and many people do. About one half of the charging points at home in the UK are supplied with a Chargemaster charging points. It's very convenient. People often ask me, how long does it take you to charge your car when you go home? I say 2 minutes. I plug it in, I go in, have something to eat and go to bed. Job done. It's like your mobile phone. You plug in your car. You also charge at work. And we're increasingly seeing companies have charging points fitted at work for their employees, for visitors and so on. And we see in 10 years' time that most companies will have charging points in their staff car parks. And then, of course, there's public charging. And people often think that is the constraint. Well, don't think it is. It's one of the tools. Only about 30% of charging is done in the public environment. It's the most high profile. And we operate the Polar charging network with about 50% of all the charging points in the UK. So we have a lot of experience on how people charge their car as they're driving around. There are typically two types of public charging. One we call destination chargers, which is the sort of thing that I plugged in this morning when I went to the railway station, jumped on a train, I plugged my car in. When I go back this evening, it'll be fully charged. Perfect. So we see every railway station, every golf club, every restaurant, every hotel. We already have partnerships with people like Intercontinental Hotels, Hilton, and so on. We see every hotel is likely to have charging points over the next, within 4 to 5 years' time. And there's already a great appetite because it gives people that additional facility at a hotel, unlike free Wi-Fi. So hotels, destination charging is going to be one of the equations. But typically that takes a while. You're going to that location anyway. That's why it's called a destination charge. Might be a supermarket, might be a restaurant. But if you want to extend the range, and we see the ranges of the autonomy of a vehicle going to about typically 250 and 300 miles, which is what most people need for everyday use. I drive a car with that range and I can use it every day with no issue at all. I don't really think about it. But there are occasions when you might want to go up to a destination, Manchester maybe, down to Bristol. And so there will be charging points, rapid charging points, and currently the standard rapid charger is 50 kilowatt, soon to be 150 kilowatt or faster. And we see the petrol companies installing these at petrol stations, maybe in a way that you spend a little bit more time at a petrol station and you might go shopping more. We've seen a big transformation in airports recently with retail environment. We see petrol stations being very much more retail environments than they are at the moment. So it's going to be a change, but all I can say is that the industry is there to support this electrification. Government needs consistency, that's what we've heard right through, but actually the standardization of technologies and so on, and the private sector's there with capital to invest in infrastructure to support this road to zero.
David, thank you very much. I bumped into Michael Woodward when we first arrived this morning, and he revealed that he had arrived here on a bicycle. So he gets the prize later on, which will be awarded by Mike Hawes. But in the meantime, he's here. His partner is UK Automotive leader at Deloitte, and he's going to bring up the rear, as it were, for now, and then we will throw it open to a wider discussion.
Justin, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. 2040 is the date, as many of you know, that the UK and French governments have pledged to end the sale of diesel and petrol engine cars. But if you go around Europe, that date changes, as Ian was mentioning earlier. If you're in the Nordics, in Sweden, in Norway, and over in the Netherlands, they're pledging the end of those sales in the early 2030s. And even Germany now is talking about early 2030 as a date they may look at ending diesel and petrol engine sales. There's almost a race to see who can be the earliest to actually ban diesel engines from the economy. But legislation isn't the only driver for the uptake of electric vehicles, clearly. Consumer demand was the other clear driver. And there's three things that the consumer has in their mind as to resistance to actually buying electric vehicles. One of them is the old chestnut of range anxiety. But for those of you who went to the Beijing Auto Show, you'll see there's 175 electric vehicles being launched, of which a third of them did well over 300 kilometres on a single charge. So I think range anxiety, we can tick the box as something that will be sorted out. The next one's around cost. A battery is typically 40% of the cost of an electric vehicle. The magic figure from our modelling is you've got to get to around 130 euros per kilowatt hour for a battery to become equivalent to an internal combustion engine. To give you some figures, in 2010 it was 900 euros per kilowatt hour. Today we're at 220. And get down to the magic figure around 130 looks like being 2022 from our modelling. And if you put all that together and put it into the various models and algorithms that we've all got, it looks like just with consumer demand by 2030, somewhere between 45 and 65% of new cars in Europe will be electric-based. But consumer behaviour is driving other changes in the industry, as we all know. And our research is suggesting that a third of citizens will enter the sharing economy by 2025. And clearly this will have an impact on car sales, with our modelling suggesting anything up to 20% drop in car sales during that period. It provides significant opportunities, though, for and threat to suppliers. So when you model existing supply base, and we clustered the components into 19 different clusters, 5 of those component clusters were growing in terms of revenue in the high hundreds. The majority, around 10, were flat or even tailing off in terms of growth, and 5 of the 19 were up to 40% drops in sales revenue. And actually, you don't need to be a brain surgeon to see those are on internal combustion engine and transmissions. So it's an interesting time. I'll end up by saying, and disagreeing slightly with Ian, which is obviously a dangerous thing to do.
That's a good thing to do. We like disagreeing. Even if it goes to violent struggle. We approve of that on the Today programme. Maybe not here.
But we enter an interesting time as we see a gathering of these ecosystems for the new mobility environment. I personally don't see it being the OEM driving that. I see that being the finance and leasing and fleet management companies, that the OEM will be part of that ecosystem, but they'll be the ones that drive the change.
Okay, before I throw it open, just a quick word about diesel, because almost everyone who's spoken today has mentioned diesel and said that it has been demonised. Morten, it's right to say you're long-term, you're giving it up, aren't you, completely? Minded to change your mind now after hearing all of that?
No, I don't.
Why not?
Well, first, I mean, it's interesting to just hear how you portray this. We talk about, just listen to the language, demonizing diesel, etc. I think it's a complicated issue, and it's a trade-off. I mean, it's low on CO2, but it's higher on NOx. It's becoming increasingly more challenging from a technical point of view to make clean diesel. It's extremely costly, both when it comes to investments and also to the cost of the product. So in the long run, we don't see this as the route going forward.
And Brian,
if you want
can I just put that to Brian? For you, particularly with the history of your company, do you see it for you long term? I mean, I'm thinking 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, I think the pass car and the commercial vehicle or long haul trucks, there's very, very different requirements in terms of what the product has to do. And diesel still is a very power-dense fuel source. All right, you can get that power, you can get it in that tank, and you can drive that huge freight right over the mountains. And so from a standpoint of today, moving that to electric would reduce how much freight you can carry by a third, potentially, just because of all the batteries you have to carry. Yeah. So looking at that technology and the work that has to be done, diesel does have a future. It has significantly reduced emissions, and we have more room to go in terms of reducing emissions even further. And I'm involved in California and in the US. We'll be looking at Euro 7 here. Very important rule, but we can reduce NOx emissions more. So it definitely has a future.
And Ian, from the point of view of consumers and buyers, do things settle down at some stage? Because we've already heard several people refer to the really precipitate drop in the buying.
They settle down. There was a precipitous drop in, for example, diesel searches on our site back in autumn of 2016. There were some political comments made at that point that exacerbated the issues we've talked about already, that saw diesel decline a lot, but it still remains a larger proportion of our searches than petrol. And alternative fuels are still minuscule in proportion. I think we have to bear in mind as well in this context that the consumer is making the decisions based on cost. As I was saying earlier, if the manufacturers aren't able to produce vehicles at sufficient scale to get the cost of the vehicle to an attractive level, or that we have a Norway-type example where we're encouraging people to make the change, consumers simply aren't going to make the move. They base their decisions on cost more than anything else.
Let me once again throw it open to anyone who wants to ask anyone anything, and you've got a couple straight away, so just hold on one second. I'll ask our microphone people to get down to. We've got two people I can see with their hands up in the front here, and then I'll come up to anywhere else. Here we go.
Hugo Griffiths from Auto Express. It's been around a year now since the 2040 Road to Zero ban was announced, and we've seen a decline in sales, we've seen a fall in diesel sales as well, and I'm still reading and hearing reports saying that petrol and diesel cars will be banned. That's not what's been announced. It's been a hiatus on conventional petrol and diesel cars. We've since heard leaks about 50-mile range and this and that and the other. Do you think it's time for a clarion call from government expressing exactly what they're talking about and clarifying that, yes, petrol and diesel cars will still be around, but they will be electrified?
David, do you want to start with that?
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. I think it does need clarity from government to exactly what they mean by what the plans are for 2040 and how we get there, you know, the road to zero. And I think there is going to be a paper released this summer sometime. I think it was hoped to be out this spring to explain the various milestones. I run a business, and to have a target over 20 years away is very difficult. I need targets in the next 5 years. And so we need some clarity on timescale, what's going to happen in 2022, 2023, and also what they really mean by the requirements in 2040. Is it a plug-in hybrid? Is it pure electric? Huge difference in what's required.
Yeah. Anyone else on that?
Well, I think just to add one point, if we're talking about 2040, it's a clear headline aim, but we don't have the map of how we're going to get there. But roughly speaking, 22 years, typically consumers change their car every 3.5 years. You're talking about probably 6 or 7 changes of car for most people to get there. They need clarity on what they're going to do in those changes of cycle. And I think they need encouragement. Our research shows that consumers don't react well at all to tax as a negative stimulus. If you take the simple example of people smoking, we tax smoking, so people stop smoking. That doesn't mean to say they go to the gym to do the sort of the good behaviour. So we need to find a way to encourage people positively with a proper level of incentive to actually get behind changing the fleet of cars. We have 35 million cars out in the fleet today. To really make an impact on the environmental footprint of the UK, we need to radically accelerate the speed of change of the older vehicles, rather than just worry about the 100 or 200,000 cars we might sell today.
Isn't the reality of it that 2040 is just a get-out? You say anything about 2040 and it just doesn't matter. You say something about
That's why it's fun.
20... It's why it's fun. Yeah, but you say something about 2022 and it begins to matter a lot. And isn't that... I mean, from the point of view of a manufacturer as well, from Volvo's point of view, it's such a long way away.
Yes. But to your point, I think it will be more interesting to... I don't want to meddle into your internal affairs. So
no, go on, feel free.
But, instead of discussing what you would potentially like to ban in 2040, maybe your government says, what would they like to have in 2040? I think that's a much better discussion.
Yeah,
Okay.
Just real quick, I would say that I understand the point about 3-5 year time frame. When you're talking about the commercial vehicle sector, really you're looking for a 10-year time frame. It takes 4 to 7 years to really develop something that's going to run for a long time. It has to be extremely reliable and durable and be worked like crazy. And so to plan for that and that level of research and development that we need, it's really a decent and consistent 10-year roadmap matters.
There was another question down there, wasn't there? Who's actually got the microphone at the moment? Because whoever has the microphone can ask the question. Here we go.
Daniel Puttican from Company Cars Today magazine. David, I'm just going to touch on a point that you made in your speech about, you said that in 3 or 4 years' time, every railway station in the UK will have a charging point. Given there are 2,600 and something railway stations on the national network, how feasible is that? Who's going to pay for all of them as well? Is that Network Rail, the TOCs, yourself? And how many charging points are you envisaging putting in at every station? 1 or 2 or sort of 10?
Number of questions there, but to answer, yes, we definitely see every railway station, as with every golf course, having charging points, every destination. And it's market driven. It's market driven. We're investing, Chargemaster is investing some £50 million in the next 2 years. If there's demand, there's a requirement, and we fulfill it. And it's not just us, there are other players. So I don't think it will be the public sector paying for it. It could be the railway operators. Most railway operators actually have charging parking companies operate the car parks, people like Q Park, NCP. We have relationships with those kind of people, and they're very receptive of giving new facilities to their customers. Yes, they will be there.
But isn't the challenge there? The whole thing has got to be made ready, because there's a charging point in my local Sainsbury's, but there's one. I mean, if you were really relying on it, you couldn't. You say you plugged in this morning at the railway station. I don't know how many other people would have been able to plug in at that railway station and might not be thinking of going electric until they can know reliably that they can. That's the difficulty.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But it's demand-driven. Over the last year, the number of electric vehicles has gone from 100,000 to 150,000. We've responded by increasing our network of rapid chargers by 50% in the same area. So if you double the number of cars, we'll have double the number of charging points. And it is demand-driven. At the railway station I parked at this morning, there's 4 bays with charging. There were 2 being used, 2 spare.
Okay, throw it open again. Yes, I always seem to be going down to this left corner, but we're not allowed to do that in the BBC. We're meant to, or maybe we are allowed to do that. But that's another question. Yes, sir.
Jim Holder from Autocar. There have already been some serious issues affecting the industry with regards to fuel economy testing. Do you think the public have enough confidence in electric range claims, and do you think more could be done to reassure the public about this?
God, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Who's going to take that on? Lying about range, like...
Well, I'm sorry, you go ahead.
Yeah, I think, of course, it's extremely difficult to understand. Since every people have different driving behaviors, it's difficult to find a standardized way of telling them as consumer information. Yes, that's going to be important for range. But what's happening now, if you look at the announcement of the types of electrical cars coming out, they are all having long range. I think the range issue will, for a vast majority of people, be solved by the next generation of electrical cars. So for most of the time, you will never really notice that your battery is draining. And then it's when you go on a long distance trip and then you need to charge anyway.
Right, so the answer to that trust issue is that you have ranges that are typically longer than you would normally need, and so the preciseness, is that going to be good enough, do you think, from a consumer's perspective? Yeah?
No, I think the consumer at the moment is worried about a gap that they see between perception and reality. So the reality of the ranges and so on may not be quite as good as it should be or as it's stated to be, but their perception is far worse still than that. And that's what's really putting them off making the jump. I mean, the average consumer is, in the UK, doing a daily drive of about 8 miles. That's well within the ranges we're talking about here, but their perception is that they'll feel fragile with that. Some people get into it and they gamification sort of with their friends on their apps and so on and talk about how efficiently they've driven. That's really only the early adopters. I think we really need to. I dispute slightly the point about being demand-driven. From the research we've seen, I think it's more supply-driven. If you put more incentives on the cars, do more communication on the reliability of the cars and the infrastructure issue that probably isn't there, but put more of them there in the train stations and the golf courses and so on, I think people will think that it's more available to them and they will bridge themselves that gap between reality and perception, which is too negative today.
Anyone else on range?
Yeah, I would say one thing, actually. I think with the introduction of the new legislation, the WLTP legislation, over the next 2 or 3 years, you'll see that confidence hopefully coming back from the consumer and general public that figures being published actually do reflect the range. I actually agree with Martin as well that you saw the figures from Ian. He was showing vehicles with ranges of 750 kilometres. If you've got 750 kilometres range, it starts becoming less of an issue.
Yeah. Okay, throw it open again. Anyone? Yes, lady right in the corner here. Hold on just 1 second. We'll get a microphone down to you. Here we go.
Vicky Brennan from Ebony Limited. We're a safety consultancy in transport. I come from a family of, I have at home a family of people that enjoy driving. They enjoy their cars, they enjoy the fun and the thrill of their cars. They're not driving them for transport. I myself have a 15-year-old MR2. So what are we going to do for people in the electric car industry, to maintain that feeling of fun? I think McLaren mentioned it earlier. That's out of my league, I'm afraid.
Okay, non-McLaren fun. Where does...
Well, of course, I think it's a really valid and good question, because we do transportation in different things. It's not just a practical thing. Well, I told you about my driving the MGTC, which is pure fun. And of course, we need to cater for that also in the future. So I think that's clear. It's also important to understand, I talked about the future of city planning and the future of cities, the types of communication that we are doing and finding good solution to all of that. I walked here this morning, I bumped into two people I didn't know, and I started to talk to them just by accident. I mean, it's really spontaneous, which gave me energy. And that's also transportation. And we need to find solutions for all of that. Just driving an electrical car is rather fun, by the way. So that's.
But that's the thing that isn't stressed. I mean, that's exactly this latest point, isn't it? That it can be fun, but the fun bit is not the stress. It's the green stuff and all the rest of it, and that in a way is, well, possibly in another.
But I think that's part of the problem, because we have portrayed electrical one way of saying it's just the green, safe, the good thing for society, and then we disregard what cars is also about, having fun, a status symbol, And we need to make electrical cars part of that as well. It's not just an economical, practical, sustainable transportation. It's also a car.
I think it's the breadth of opportunities that are out there, actually. We talked a lot earlier, Ian mentioned some great examples of industry change, and that's what I was referring to earlier about the change that's out there is really a challenge for the industry, but it's also a huge opportunity. Take a couple of examples. The talk on electric vehicle is immediate. The first time I drove electric vehicles a few years back, I put my foot down, and the engineer was telling me not to. I knew I was waiting for him to look the other way. I put my foot down, and I shot off because the talk's immediate, and the cars aren't heavier, and if they're McLarens, they're lighter. So they're fantastic for those people. Obviously, if you're driving in an autonomous way and a controlled speed limit, that's different. But if you're, for example, that kind of consumer, you'll love the fact that your car does other things for you than just get you from place to place or give you a thrill. It allows you to do stuff in the car, the connected facilities, the space that you've got, where you'll use it in a whole different way. So I think that actually the consumer can benefit massively if we accelerate this journey and allow people to use cars in the way that suits them.
Yeah. How many of you are driving an automatic transmission? Probably a lot of you, yeah. So how many of you did make a business case for buying an automatic transmission? It's more expensive than a manual transmission, so what's the business proposition? I mean, it's zero, people don't do that. But when we talk about electrical cars, then suddenly we need to make a business case out of it, saying we can drive cheaper per mile. But we have tons of things in our cars which we find value for and paying. So it's part of finding the value of electrical cars, not just by pounds that you save.
It is also, you touched on ownership models and the idea of the sharing economy and all the rest of it, the way in which people drive, the way in which people interact with a car, and as much as they're maybe having it for a weekend or whatever, that's got to be melded in with the enjoyment still of driving, hasn't it?
Absolutely. So just picking that point up that you've made there, you're starting to see subscription models starting to come into the industry. At the moment, it's around being able to swap a car within a particular brand. But once the big finance and leasing companies really bring those subscription models to life, then, at the weekend you could have a very fast electric vehicle.
You can have the McLaren after all. And you said you wouldn't, but
have it for the weekend, and the rest of the week have an SUV. And I think those are the sorts of things we'll start seeing.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, throw it again to Anna. Yes, stay right in the middle of that section there, if we could go back there. Thank you. It's like auditioning for Question Time. I don't think I've been mentioned in the running for that yet, but maybe after today.
Thank you. Erin Baker from Auto Trader and Woodward. Probably a question for David. I think you picked up on whether it's supply or demand, and it's for charging infrastructure, and I think it's crucial it gets hammered out by the industry, because you've got the Jaguar I-Pace out at the moment, a great car, lots of people want it, we've all driven it as journalists, we love it, but that really needs a 150 kilowatt charger, and I think I'm right in saying there are none of those in the UK until the end of the year, which means that I can't advise someone to buy one, and it seems that's an example of an OEM putting its stuff out there and saying, great, here you go, we've made a very sexy car, but no one can buy one because the rapid charge infrastructure doesn't match it. And my second point is EU targets. Are there currently EU targets for charging infrastructures that post-Brexit will be withdrawn? And if so, will people like Chargemaster step in to ensure that those targets are still met?
Yes, well, I totally agree, and perhaps I misled in a statement. It is the supply does need to go ahead of the demand and then keep up with it. You do need to see a visible infrastructure out there. It helps people have confidence that they can use their electric cars. So we do always try to, if we think we need one charging point, we'll typically put 2 or 3 in. To answer your question, particularly about the iPace, I've got an iPace on order. Can't wait for it in September. It will take, actually, at the moment, the iPace will only charge at 100 kilowatt. You're right, there are no 100 kilowatt chargers or 150 kilowatt chargers in the UK, but we'll install about 500 during the course of next year. So it's a short-term thing. There aren't many iPaces on the road at the moment. There will be next year, and that those charging points will be there.
And on Brexit? Our other point was about Brexit and whether post-Brexit there is a change in the way in which these things are regulated or enforced, and we don't keep up or go our own way.
Absolutely right. Brussels did put some targets out there for charging infrastructure, very vague, very ambiguous. I don't think anybody in the UK actually really, there was no legal backing to them. We do see that there have been no shortage of charging points. Basically, our formula is for every 10 new electric cars, there'll be 1 new public charging point. That's a formula that works at the moment. There's 15,000 public charging points out there, 150,000 electric vehicles. When there will be 1 million electric cars, which we expect to be in 2021, there will be 100,000 public charging points. As simple as that.
I just wanted to note the differences here as we're talking about pass car charging infrastructure versus some of these other applications where maybe you have a bus that's going to run around the city in a specific path for a period of time and then go back to the depot and charge. Yeah. Right. So you can have that bus fleet specifically have that charging infrastructure. If you're talking maybe small pickup and delivery, again, they return to base. You may not need that widespread, publicly available charging infrastructure. But if we're talking about some of these city-to-city or other long-haul type applications, that's where you may need significant infrastructure that the government would have to likely be involved in to make it so those vehicles can go long distances, and they'll have to be charged really quick. Because if you're not driving, you're not making money. So that's significant.
Yeah.
Just really quickly to add to this point, I think the supply and demand issue is the vital one here, to be honest with you. It's not just about the infrastructure, though that is key. It's also about the actual cars. I mean, Erin mentioned the iPace, fantastic car. Bring fantastic cars into the market and affordable electric cars or alternative fuel vehicles, and people will actually want to buy them. Today, our research shows that 75% of people actually want to buy that kind of vehicle. They consider it in their purchase set. And 1 in 2 are more sensitive to pollution and environmental issues now than they were a year ago. But actually, they don't buy them because their societal sort of desire to do good is overpowered by the fact that they are simply unaffordable in most cases. So they're inaccessible. And 3 out of the top 3 factors of choosing a car are still cost-related: the car itself, the running cost, and the overall total cost of ownership equation. So that it's quite simple in my opinion.
Is a point of realism on which to finish our discussion. We will break now. We'll meet again in half an hour, please, at 20 to 12. A round of applause, please, for our panel. Thank you all very much.